Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you all doing today? It is hot. It is super hot in the uninsulated upstairs portion of this old craftsman home. So we're doing what we can today. So bear with me as we go through this sweltering moment. But I'm happy to have the heat here. I hope you guys are all doing well today. Welcome to our historic virtual tour of the Fort Lewis Museum. I'm very excited for this one. It's a super cool building and it has a ton of awesome history to it. And it's a place that I feel like most people always see from I-5 and they're like, well, that's a swanky Swiss chalet. I wonder what that is. And then they keep driving and never think about it again until the next time they drive by it. So hopefully, if I do my job right tonight, you are going to be encouraged and empowered to enter this building. I think one of the things that dissuades people from going to visit it is that, and I've already seen this in the comments, a lot of people assume that if you don't have a military ID, you can't get on base to go see it. But in fact, there is a back entrance to the museum specifically designed for the casual civilian going to go explore. And so all you have to do is, if you're southbound on I-5, I forget which exit it is, but I'll be sure to post it before we're done. You take one exit past the JBLM exit towards DuPont. You just curve around the corner there, and there's this, it looks like you're driving into the woods for a second on a gravel driveway, and they're in a chain link parking lot. There's a phone number to call, and then they'll send someone from the front desk to let you in. And it is easy, breezy, lemon squeezy. So let's take a moment to do some housekeeping stuff. Number one, I'm Chris Staudinger. I'll be your guide for the evening. I would like to give a huge shout out to our sponsor, Cava. It's not just sparkling wine, and it's certainly not champagne. Cava derives its name from cave in Spanish, where it's traditionally aged in the Costa Brava region, my personal favorite, of Spain. Now you know more about my taste. Also, if you enjoy your tour tonight and you would like to show that monetarily, you have a link to our PayPal button right on the front page of prettygrittytours.com. Tips are always appreciated, never expected. And last but certainly not least, I would like to give a special shout out to all the people over at the Fort Lewis Museum for donating their precious time and letting us get in during a quarantine to film this facility. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. All right, I think those are all the mandatory thank yous and sincere thank yous that we've got at the beginning. Does anyone have any big questions for me before we get started? I want to make sure that I'm addressing everyone's queries before I just go off on a historic tirade. I got to give it a moment for it to catch up, and then I'll see everyone's comments. So far, so good. Thank you, Jessica. I can always count on you. Exit 119. 119 southbound, right off of I-5. And yeah, it's not something you would ever just encounter on your own, I don't think, but it's a pretty easy access to the museum. All right, well, let's take a quick look at our building today, shall we? So this is the Fort Lewis Army Museum when it was originally constructed back in 1919. That's how old that building is. And as you can see, it is modeled after a traditional Swiss chalet, as I'm sure we all have bequeathed to someone in our wills. And this building was installed pretty quickly. Some backstory for you all, because it's kind of a cool origin story for Fort Lewis. Back in the olden days, back in 1916, I believe it was, there were just a bunch of businessmen and professionals who were out in the woods near American Lake getting prepared in case America jumped into World War II or I'm sorry, World War I in earnest. And so they were just out there, volunteers, trying to keep their skills sharp. Some of them were National Guard. And one of these guys was like, you know, from my time in the National Guard, I know that the Army's going to send a scouting team out to look for places to build a military camp, and it should be here. So he convinced everyone that this was a good idea, and they're all on board with it. So much so that after they went back and forth to DC, and they're like, if we buy a huge parcel of land and donate it to the US government, will you guys build a military facility here? US military was like, yep, we're into it. So the bond that had to get passed was a $2 million bond in 1916 for the people of Tacoma specifically, but Pierce County, to purchase this piece of land and then donate it as a gift to the US military. And I believe it had 86% approval when it was on the ballot. Everyone was like, hells yes, we're into it. And so that's how it happened. They convinced the military scouting team to come out. They saw the American Lake area and they're like, this is perfect. We could definitely train soldiers here. And thus was born Camp Lewis. And it's important to note that before it was Fort Lewis, it was just Camp Lewis. It was a temporary training facility out there owned by the U.S. government, but they weren't sure that they were going to set down roots for the long term and really develop the infrastructure out there, which, as we all know, living in 2020, they did. So, a spoiler alert for any of you who are time traveling right now, it's going to happen. Also, there will be a pandemic. You should know about it. Ironically, 100 years almost to the year after Spanish influenza, but I digress. So, Camp Lewis is established, and they find almost instantly that there's 37,000 soldiers out there now being trained in this new military facility. And so they were like, oh shoot, we're going to have to start building something to accommodate the people that are coming to visit them, specifically families. And so they called it the Hut. It was a little Swiss chalet, very much like the Lewis Army Museum, but it only had 16 rooms. And before it was even completed, they realized the error of their ways. They're like, oh no, we have so many more people coming to visit. We have to do something even more. And so they immediately started construction on the Red Shield Inn. Now, the Red Shield Inn is the original name for Fort Lewis Army Museum, which I need to abbreviate like the military does with everything because it's getting to be a mouthful every time I say it. But they built this, and I believe it was completed in 1919. And it was a 160-room hotel. And it was pretty simple. It had electricity, it had a bed, 2 chairs, and a sink for every room, and then the bathrooms were down the hall. But at the time, it was considered to be like the cream of the crop. It was the most modern facility, and people loved it. They were all about it. And so it actually started to draw even more attention to it. I want to give you guys, here we go. Here's some of the original shots of it. And here's a mock-up of the facility as it looks today. And you can see one of the coolest parts about it is that it has that really cool courtyard in it. The helicopter is not an original addition from 1919. They added that later when it became a museum. But the courtyard very much is part of the original building design. And they wanted to do it that way because the original architects were like, every single room in this hotel will have an exterior view. It'll be courtyard or field, but every room will look out. Nothing's going to look into an alley. Nothing's going to just look at another wall. So it was very top of the line. What really sort of propelled the Red Shield Inn to the success that it had for a long period of time was my boy here, Major General Greene. Look at this dude. He is the epitome of badass, in my personal opinion. So Major General Henry Greene has this awesome backstory. I'm not going to get into all of his stuff tonight. Some highlights. He joined the military very early on, graduated 16th out of a class of 66, took command of a volunteer army of Sioux at one point and was fighting out in the frontiers. And then when he took over command of Camp Lewis, he really got to dig into his major passion in life, which was preventing vice in soldiers. He had a conviction that you could actually bring a soldier back from a combat theater and have them more morally upright than when they left. And the thing that was really dissuading him from that success was just outside of Camp Lewis, and they called it the Joy Zone. So, as with a lot of military facilities, the Joy Zone was a den of prostitution, essentially, that sort of cropped up right outside the gates of Camp Lewis, and the soldiers were wont to visit pretty regularly. And so Major General Greene shut that down right away, and then was so zealous in his pursuit that in the fall of the camp's birth, he prevented, in fact, I'm trying to remember the exact word, essentially put a moratorium on anyone on base going to visit Seattle. That's right, my friends. Seattle was such a shady den of sin and vice that it was a no-go zone for everyone at Camp Lewis. Full stop. Just for everyone's edification, that didn't last super long. Eventually they had to reel that back a little bit. But his major contribution was to install Green Park right across the way from Fort Lewis. And this was a facility that was designed to have every sort of clean fun that a soldier could want. So it had a Chinese restaurant, 2 Waffle Houses, a billiards hall, a soda fountain, a theater, all sorts of like fun things that soldiers could do that didn't involve purchasing women for the hour. This was very successful, strangely, and it was encouraged by the fact that they had essentially like fun bucks. You could buy these booklets if you were a citizen of Tacoma or Seattle, and then donate them to a soldier, and they would tear out these coupons that were then good for different experiences at all the different places in Green Park. Now, unfortunately, Green Park no longer exists today. That lush amusement park of good, clean fun has faded into antiquity, but the only remaining structure from it is the Red Shield Inn, or as we know it today, the Fort Lewis Army Museum, which I'm just going to start calling the museum, because if you don't know what I'm talking about by now, I don't know how to help you at this point. Although, if you're tuning in late, we are talking about the Fort Lewis Army Museum, formerly known as the Red Shield Inn, constructed in 1919, servicing the greater Pierce County area, but primarily those staying at Camp Lewis, which then later became Fort Lewis. I think there we go. Okay, so here we go. What I love about this building is because it was originally designed to be a 160-room hotel. It's still got that vibe to it. So as soon as you enter the building, it's got this lush lobby, and these leather chairs are reminiscent of the original deep, cushy leather chairs that were first installed there as the lobby. The fireplace is original, and the reason it was called the Red Shield Inn is because it was a project of the Salvation Army. Now, the Salvation Army had become very popular after its establishment in the late 1800s for its humanitarian compassion work in foreign theaters, and so by the time it made its way into the US, people had a very good feeling towards it. So when they offered to build the Red Shield Inn, everyone was on board with it. After the end of World War I, there was a pretty steep decline in people coming to visit the inn, and so the Salvation Army made an offer to the U.S. military, specifically Fort Lewis, that they could purchase the facility and then use it for officer housing or a continuation of Green Park's fun zone, essentially. And they sold it to the U.S. military for $1. I think it was appraised at like 200,000 in the 1920s, something possibly more. In case you haven't noticed already, it's a giant building. It's something like, I've forgotten the number already. Something like 40,000 square feet. It's massive, and it's 3 stories, not including a sort of pseudo basement that we're going to look at a little bit later. So they could have stood to make a lot of money off of it, but they were like, nah, it's important that we're doing the right thing. Salvation Army. So it goes through this ups and downs period. It is for a period transient housing, not wanderers on the street, but if you were a soldier coming back and then being transitioned out of the military, you could have an apartment there for a period. It was called the Fort Lewis Apartments. It was officer housing for a period of time because they couldn't find any affordable housing for officers in the area, specifically during World War II. And then it's been used for a few other things, including the set of a film in the 1927, if I'm not mistaken, the Patent Leather Kid. I think that's what it's called. We'll get into that in a second, though. So when it was eventually, it's gone through all these different phases where it's gone into disrepair, and someone's like, let's tear that sucker down. And the 3 times that was recommended, fortunately, it didn't happen. But by the early 1970s, the building was in pretty deep disrepair, and it was officially shut down until someone was like, hold up, why don't we turn this into a museum? We have this historic structure here. Now is an opportunity to do something with it and to really turn it into a facility that we can use again. So when you're looking at the exterior here, some things that I think are super cool. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the fact that it looks like a little Swiss Alpenhaus. And that was an intentional design by the Salvation Army as sort of a hearkening back to their European days. Also, you might notice in front the 2 brass cannons there. Those are war trophies from the Spanish-American War captured in Cuba. Both of them were cast in the 1700s, and you'll notice, if you've been out and around the Tacoma area, they do look distinctly familiar to the one in Wright Park and the one in Point Defiance, and that's not a coincidence. They were all captured same time, same place, and then sort of dispersed, sprinkled around the Pierce County area, if you will. The other thing you'll notice is that it's a perfect opportunity to sort of talk about history for the facility there, because as a historic structure, it gives them plenty of opportunities to do cool stuff, like have a bunch of model cars out there. You put a sepia tone on this picture, and it's as if it was just taken back in the 1930s. And here we go. If you go to the museum today, you'll notice that the cannons have not been polished in some time. They've lost that glossy brass luster, and they've got that sort of green patina on them today. But if you were to polish them up, that is what they would look like today. So let's take you guys back here really quick. At this point, we're going to sort of break it up into a couple things. I want to actually give you footage of the building. I want you to actually be able to experience it. And then we are going to talk a little bit about the haunted experience of the building in there, because it is pretty classy. Some cool stuff has happened in there, and it's a part of the building that not a lot of people get to experience. So we are going to go in there and do that. Let's see. Oh, good. So we've got a link to current places that are off limits to Joint Base Lewis McChord. That's pretty good. I'm checking if there are any comments here, any questions before we jump into the building, but it doesn't look like it. So if you're ready, let's head in. So traditionally, when you would have entered into the main lobby of the Red Shield Inn, you would have been able to go right to the women's drawing room, sort of retreat area, let's say, and then to the left was a men's smoking lounge. And that area was adjacent to a 100-person dining hall that, by all accounts, every time I read a story about it, it's commented that it had exquisite food, reasonable prices, and a really nice theme all the way throughout, where the silverware, the flatware, the napkins all had that Red Shield logo on them. And especially in the early 1900s, people are like, thank you for going the extra mile. And if you've ever seen pictures of people flying in the early days of aviation, you know that people went way above and beyond in the hospitality industry back in the day. So when we are about to go on our virtual experience here, you get to enter the building, and we're going to go to the left to that men's smoking lounge dining hall area, which has now been converted into a sort of visual history of the Army's presence here in the Pacific Northwest. Off we go. Also, let me know if the audio is wonky at any point. I've got these fans in here so that I don't die of heat stroke. So it talks a lot about the presence of Lewis and Clark, sort of leading their contingent out here, Corps of Discovery, taking a look at everything. It talks a lot about the beginning of Camp Lewis being formed out here, and sort of military installations in the early days, as well as the very early military expeditions, including Fort Steilacoom, Puget Sound, San Juan Islands, and so forth. And then the museum curators have done a very deliberate job of making sure to include the narrative of the indigenous tribes of the Pacific Northwest and how they have been a part of, and obviously at times in conflict with, the military in the area. It's a really fantastic museum, and they've done just such an incredible job of trying to represent the diversity of the area, but also diversity within the military, and trying to bring a lot of those stories to light when they are normally, shuffled to the side. When you think of a sort of a military narrative, the tendency is to think of a very standard white male version of that. But they've done a really good job of making sure that every facet of the military has been represented there. One of the big parts of the military history, specifically in the American Lake area, is actually of the Buffalo Soldiers, the African American division of the Army before desegregation, which then went on to be the first park rangers in the country. And there's a lot of representation for that here in the museum as well. Got a good question here, as when did it change officially from Camp Lewis to Fort Lewis? And I believe that was in the late 30s. Late 30s, early 40s. I'm not sure the exact date, but essentially once things were gearing up for World War II, I believe is my understanding, that they're like, okay, it's time to really dig in for this. Kava break. What I love about this section here too is that when it's not a pandemic and the museum is open, each of these video screens plays either clips or pictures that people have actually taken from their time in foreign theaters. And they've just got some incredible stuff and some amazing stories that they represent there. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a treat here. Eric Flint, who is like a major part of this museum. I'm not even sure what his official title is anymore, but he is one of the major curators and a huge driving force behind this. He's the guy who took over the program and breathed new life into it. And he's here to answer any specific minutia questions that I might forget. I also love this shot here because you get to see the original safe that was installed for the Red Shield Inn. And the little plaque up there does a good job of describing the fact that that sinks you into the moment where this was a hotel where you could keep your valuables and things that were important to you in the hotel safe while you were there. And that sucker is embedded in the wall. When they took over with the museum, they had to have a locksmith come in to actually open it up. And while I ask frequently, I don't know that anybody knows the combination to this day. And if they've remembered it recently, Eric will jump on to let me know. Director. He's the director of the Lewis Army Museum. So he's here to fact check me, which no pressure. No pressure. Normally, I also like to give a little disclaimer before all of our tours that I am, at my core, a travel expert and a journalist. I'm an investigator of fantastic stories, and I like to repurpose that information so it's digestible for everyone. I've never made the claim, and you can go back through all our videos and make sure this is true. Never made the claim to be a historian. I let the Eric Flints and the Steve Dunkelbergers of the world wear that heavy mantle. It's just my job to inform. But still, I know more dates than Paul, so you can take that to the bank. Now, on the right hand, once you enter the lobby, there is a wing that goes back into the museum that represents a more modern approach to the military history, and specifically with Fort Lewis. So when you're going through there, you get to see a lot of the combat theaters, a lot of the artillery weapons, and then some things that have actually been brought back. And one of the things that I've loved about our relationship with the Fort Lewis Army Museum has been that they were the first place that agreed to do an unspoken history project with us, which, if you're not familiar, back when Pretty Gritty was operating on the streets, not just online, we had a program called Unspoken History where we would go into specifically museums and let them sort of unearth collections of things that they wouldn't normally be able to display or didn't have room for. And the first one that we did with them was sort of looking at artifacts that addressed sensitive topics in the military. And one of them specifically was sexism in the military. So they dug up Eric, Heidi, and Jen, the crack team that works in the museum there, dug up these fantastic articles, comics, pictures, pieces of military history that sort of showed just how sexist it could be at the time, and sort of looked at it in a modern context. Also, just a ton of swords from World War II brought back from Japan, a lot of Nazi memorabilia. And this is the one that I was talking about. This is a fantastic advertisement that they had. I think this was in the Bugle, if I'm not mistaken, where, as it was told to me, there was a committee that was like, what can we do to improve the experience at the military? And someone was like, why don't we have go-go dancers? And that suggestion got taken up to a point where people were like, yep, and they approved it. So this young woman right here is entertaining the good old boys at Fort Lewis. And so for a brief period of time, it was the military's policy for entertainment to bring in go-go dancers. Really good stuff. In the purple there, this is Jen. She is one of the fantastic historians that works at the Fort Lewis Army Museum and who's been really responsible for bringing a lot of this good historic knowledge and curation to light and then presenting it in a very digestible way. And the pieces that you look at here, these are original pieces of art done by soldiers while overseas in combat. And it was a project of the Army to just request just amateur art just to sort of get a feel for what was going on overseas. And then this curated art collection has been kept in the archives at the Fort Lewis Army Museum. And some of the pieces are really extraordinary and moving and can be very controversial or disturbing because it's art done in a time of war. But it was a fantastic opportunity to get a chance to actually go in and look at these artifacts and interact with them. So I'm excited to have Unspoken History be a program that we do again in the future. And the Fort Lewis Army Museum is just a phenomenal place to do it. But I wanted to take you guys now through the modern military wing. So obviously it's not all modern. As you can see, it talks a lot about World War I and World War II, but it progresses now through the ages to the places that we would be more familiar with. I love the maps here as well. It shows maneuvers in different colored lights, so you push the buttons and it gives you a chronological or strategic presentation of movements in the field. Also, you'll notice just a really excellent display. And one of the things that I've heard Eric talk to me about is that even in the mannequins that they try and do here, they're trying to represent the diversity of the military as it's moved forward in life. And it's something I really commend the museum on, and I think it speaks to a broader audience in a really engaging way. As we swing around the corner here, we are still technically on the first floor of this 3-story hotel museum. And we're going to curve around the corner here before we get to take you up some additional floors. And the 3rd floor of this hotel museum was, I don't even know if derelict is the exact word, but it was uninhabitable for all intents and purposes, to the point where it had to go through a major remodel in the early 2000s before it could be occupied, and now they're finally able to use it for various things. And that is ahead from the Saddam Hussein statue in Iraq that was brought back. Just the amount of stuff that you can see in this museum, you could spend days here. So I always recommend to people that you set aside a couple hours and then just go one wing at a time, and feel free to visit because they are open Wednesday through Sunday, I believe 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Admission is free. So it's a U.S. government funded operation. You should go and experience it. But I know what a lot of you are here for, and I don't want to disappoint anyone. So I want to talk to you guys about some of the creepy stuff that has happened at this facility. Some of the stories that have gone untold, and then to give you guys an opportunity to ask some questions about that. So in 1927, The Patent Leather Kid is a silent film that was filmed on the fort. Here it is, screenshots from it. I admittedly have not seen this film yet. If anyone who's watching currently have seen this, please let me know, because I would love to talk to someone about it before I can track down a copy of it myself. This is what we would be looking at from the time period when it was filmed, but in the 1920s, they had the entire cast and crew staying in this hotel while they were filming, and tragically, one of the sort of like background actors in this ends up getting murdered, allegedly, in one of the hotel rooms. And this doll plays an integral role in that story. So we got an opportunity to go up and actually film this room, but the room where it happened has had sort of weird occurrences ever since. And the most notable one is that people have described seeing a guy who looked like he was dressed as a cowboy wandering around the building late at night, and that he either looked angry or deeply sad, like he was trapped somewhere. Full disclosure, as we're flying through this building, Jen, who's in charge of a lot of mannequin placement, has done a really good job of just making the building creepy on its own sometimes, because you'll just encounter like a bathtub full of limbs every now and then, because they have to store those extra display mannequins somewhere, and it gives me the EBGBs every time I'm in there. So here you go. We're about to take a look. So this is room 337 here. You can see the original hotel room vibe to it. It's got the little steam radiator, an ensuite sink, and then this would have had 2 chairs and a bed. But this is the room that's had the most activity in it. And while I can't confirm it, the story is that the haunting of the ghost dressed in cowboy attire was so intense that they actually brought in 3 priests to do an exorcism there. That the ghost appeared to them, and they asked him to leave, and he said that he would. But ever since then, that doll just will move on its own. That they'll set it up in different places and find it has jumped off of the stool and is moved across the room, or that mannequins near it will have moved around. A good example of that is this room of mannequins, which is the more tame of the two. Across the hall is this room, and this is the one that gets the most activity, where these mannequins will just turn all towards the corner on their own, or to our left here, this bathtub, all of the hands will be raised in the morning. Now, I actually had an opportunity while I was there touring the facility to go and take a look at the basement section. And so I wanted to give you guys a quick look at that as well, because it's pretty sweet. So here we are following down into it. And this area also has a ton of activity. You know I can't help doing that. If you didn't expect it coming at this point, I don't know what you guys are doing here. Honestly. Okay. I'm going to give you guys a second to recover. And then we're going to go back to the basement. But quickly, some good stuff about basements in the area. Number one, when the first idea of building a larger hotel popped into someone's mind, they hired a Seattle firm to do it, and their grand vision was for a 500 plus room hotel, and they got as far as digging the basement. Once they dug the basement, the project was abandoned for a variety of reasons, and so that basement footprint was converted into a swimming pool. And then it wasn't until the Red Shield Inn came in that they had a whole new facility. So this basement wasn't designed to be, a full basement, super livable or anything, but just to provide additional space under the building. And I really do apologize to anyone who's unhappy with jump scares. I wasn't going to put it in the historic tour, but I'm an addict. The good news is that's the last one on this tour. We're gonna go back into the basement. Oh, here we go. You're gonna have to go through it again. Don't worry. We're gonna get past this point, and it's gonna be totally fine. Okay, you knew it was coming. So you can see the basement is incredibly short, and again, it's because it was never designed to be like rooms or anything. But if you cruise around here, you get to see that it is, in essence, a daylight basement. It's got a ton of windows up and down here. And then my favorite part is actually just up here on the right as we cruise around the facility here. You can see more storage down here. Really good stuff. And I actually, aside from the various body parts stored in the basement down here, I actually am very impressed at this museum because they have this basement that is primarily open space, and for a historic structure and a museum and just a basement at all, to have all that usable space and not have just crammed it full of storage is really a Herculean feat. Normally, after I do a jump scare, the cat jumps up on me, so we're doing pretty well so far tonight. Take you guys back to the quick lobby here. I just want to make sure that I'm giving you guys an opportunity to ask any additional questions there. We'll do a quick recap here, but essentially, Salvation Army builds a hotel. They use it as a facility to allow families visiting their soldier who's now at camp and then eventually Fort Lewis. Eventually that then transitions into either transition housing, officer quarters, apartments for people living on base. And then after a long period of time, after which it was used as an amusement facility as part of Green Park, it then goes on to become abandoned. And then in the 1970s, people make the recommendation that it should be used as not only a historic structure to be saved, but that also as a history museum. And to have that juxtaposition of a 100-year-old building now that gets to be used as the Army Museum is really, really extraordinary. So they're very fortunate in that, and I love everything that they're doing there. So if you have the opportunity to go and visit, we're going to say thank you again to them. Please do. It's an incredible facility, well managed, and it does a great job of telling the whole story of the military in the area. So I am nervous, if anyone's asking. I never know if the door's open or closed. Anytime I do haunted stuff, something comes back for me. Just like when I used to make fun of the ghost of the little girl at Stadium High School, and then weird stuff started happening and all my equipment was getting tossed out. No me gusta. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have further questions, please let me know. If you have enjoyed your tour tonight and you would like to tip, I'm always amenable to it. Right down there on our front page of prettygrittytours.com, there is a PayPal link for all of you who are interested. But if you're super interested in showing your appreciation, keep your eyes open, because I am on the hunt for forging equipment. I am intent on becoming an amateur blacksmith during this period of my life, and I've got a forge and a rail tie anvil and some hammers. But if you find any like cool equipment, specifically a leg vise or tongs, you let me know, and I'm willing to offer fair price to any of that equipment. So really, that's the best tip that you could give. Other than that, stay tuned for future programming. We are going to have a really sweet tour next Wednesday of the architects of Tacoma and the buildings that they've dreamt up. The day after that, on Thursday, we are going to be doing a sort of just like things that we love in Tacoma tour, Paul and we'll be there with Quabi, who runs the Peace Bus in Tacoma. So we're very excited about that one. And then we'll be releasing new programs, hopefully on Monday, a calendar of events on Monday. So again, huge thank you to Eric, Heidi, and Jen at the Lewis Army Museum for giving us the opportunity to actually look inside this building, not just virtually, but as soon as they reopen after the COVID-19 situation, they're giving you the opportunity to actually look inside the building. So thank you to all of them, and a huge thank you to everyone in the armed forces right now, because not only is it because of their history and contribution that we have this facility to even talk about, but so many other things in life. So thank you for your service. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Chris Staudinger, your guide for the evening, thanking you for joining us tonight and sitting with me through yet another jump scare. I will see you next Wednesday for the Architects Tour of Tacoma. Thank you so much.